Arizona players have begun to hit the transfer portal. How many of them are coming to Washington?
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Tomashoff. That's Lars Hanson. He writes for Inside the Huskies of Fan Nation Sports Illustrated. I'm the site editor over with Huskies Wire. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen of the day. And please remember to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and hit that little notification bell so you never miss an episode. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time, by the way. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Lars Hanson, we finally saw the Arizona mass exodus into the transfer portal begin last night. So I'm just going to read off some of the names here real quickly of the guys that did hit the portal. Quarterback Damon Williams, running back Jonah Coleman, running back Adam Muhammad, wide receiver Audric Harris, tight end Kean Burnett, tight end Dorian Thomas, offensive lineman Ray Polito, defensive back Apicians Prysock, defensive back Jordan Shaw, and then this morning, defensive back Tacario Davis also hit the transfer portal. That's a lot of talented names. That's not all the biggest names, but we have to assume in the situation that some of those guys could be following Jedd Fisch to Washington. We talked a little bit about some of these guys on our Thursday show, but if there are a couple names that you want to pick off that list, I feel like Prysock is right there at the top. Jonah Coleman is as well. And then I think that Raymond Polito might be the number 3 guy of, yeah, this is somebody who you would hope that this new Husky coaching staff can go out and acquire in the portal.
Yeah, and I mean, even honestly, all the way down to Burnett and because when you look at Washington's tight end room, especially with Jedd Fisch and the way they want to use that offense, I mean, yeah, you have Josh Cuevas and Quentin Morris, I believe, got one more year of eligibility.
Yeah, Quentin Morris will be back.
So I mean, there's like, it's not that the roster is totally bare, but losing both your starters, Devin Coleman, Jack Westover, Ryan Otten, the ultimate question mark there. You kind of
we saw Guerin and Landon Hatchett enter the transfer portal as well.
Right, exactly, and then you have the entire starting offensive line also gone or in the portal one way or another. So yeah, looking at that, I mean, first of all, I think, you know, with Polito being a guard, I still think you're probably going to take at least 2 guards, probably 2 tackles.
Sure.
So I would imagine pretty much a majority of Washington's offensive line from last year is gone. Arizona's is going to come in. I mean, I think that probably you're going to see at least 3 or 4 of those guys come up by the end of this whole process. Not
sure,
not
and
soon,
then
but it's going to be a bit.
Sorry. One guy that I feel like we also just need to mention in this conversation because it still looks like he's with Washington throughout this whole process is San Diego State transfer Drew Azzopardi, who you and I both really like. He was one of the top-rated offensive linemen in the transfer portal by 247 Sports. So that's another guy who you want to keep an eye on, see what happens there. And then another guy who I would call it an outside shot at best, where he's in the transfer portal, and we'll see, you know, how much the staff really wants to recruit him, is offensive tackle Caden Proctor from Alabama. Obviously, I think most people are assuming that he's going to go back home, end up at Iowa, or we'll see what happens there. But I just want to throw that out there as an interesting name. But then the 2 guys that I really want to talk about in this are Apicians Prysock and Tacario Davis, where Washington has already lost 3 members of their starting secondary from last year, 4 if you want to count Dominic Hampton, who's out of eligibility, in Asa Turner, Mish Powell, who committed to Miami, and Jabbar Muhammad, who looks like he's down to Alabama, Texas, and Oregon. And so if the Huskies are able to pull in Tacario Davis and Prysock, that's a really nice reload in the secondary. And then, of course, we talked yesterday about Leroy Bryant, Curly Reed, Caleb Presley, 1 or maybe even 2 of those guys making a significant jump and becoming part of the rotation. And I know you and I both really like cornerbacks coach John Richardson, who we're going to talk a little bit more later about a little bit more later on the show. But I feel like that might be one of the biggest areas of improvement outside of, you know, you can say what you will about Apicians Prysock versus Jabbar Muhammad in terms of like a number 1 corner. Why I'd consider him the number 1, and Tacario Davis, I wouldn't say he's very far behind what they were doing. You know, it's almost like a 1A, 1B there. But with Jabbar, what he was able to do this year, I would still consider him probably the best of that group. But it's not like there's a huge teardrop there. But having those 2 guys, I would consider that an upgrade over 1 player.
Right, and I will say I would say you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe Peacock is younger than Muhammad.
Prysock?
or Price Lock. Yeah, sorry.
So,
But I believe he's a little bit younger because I know Muhammad has one more year left.
yeah, he has two if he wants them.
Right. So I think that's kind of almost like kind of the step Jabbar took this year is the one that Fisch can take next season, right? Where he's already had one of the better seasons in the Pac-12 this past year.
Right.
And Davis, the other one that I mentioned actually yesterday on the show, was like, well, he's not in the portal yet, but he led the team in pass breakups down in Arizona last year. So
he's also the top-rated corner in the Pac-12 per PFF.
And so, as we say, love to fit a narrative. So again, but that's no disrespect to Jabbar because we know how good Jabbar is. But I do think when you look at a size perspective, they're both more prototypical, long outside island corners. Where Jabbar kind of had a couple more inches, he would have made so many more plays. Which is not a slight again to Jabbar, right? Jabbar was already making a ton of plays, but just when you have those more traditional, bigger cornerbacks, you're able to do a little bit more.
So let's switch gears here and talk a little bit about some of the other positions in need, because offensive line is one you and I talked about being a really big one. We talked a little bit about the running backs. I think that one that we're really going to need to just kind of talk about where there are going to be a couple more additions that need to be made are at linebacker, where we'll see it looks like Jacob Anu is probably going to end up staying around with Arizona. We'll kind of see how that plays out, where that seems like the way he's leaning right now. But it seems like, especially with former Washington commit transfer Ethan Barr going to the University of Central Florida, it seems like one or two more players at that position might be needed. One that you and I talked about is true freshman who could still like get released from his NLI. We'll see what happens there. Is Stacey Bay from Rancho Cucamonga.
Yeah, the linebacker. I think the linebacker position, especially in this day and age in college football, and we don't know exactly what type of defense Jedd Fisch is going to run. He didn't expand too much. He didn't say, "Hey, it's going to be a 4-2-5, a 3-4." But from the kind of just expectation generally, there's been enough linebackers that have been in the portal that kind of, as long as you can find it, because you have Devin Bryant, you have Kamori House, who I believe has not been released yet or not publicly.
Kamori hasn't. Yeah.
Right. So you have the youth, right? You're just looking for a kind of couple of top end guys. You still have Carson Bruner, still have Alfonso Tuputala, who have not hit the portal
Jordan Whitney
yet.
In that mix he's really promising too. I like him.
Right. I was going to say Devin Bryant and Jordan. So you kind of really only need maybe one or two, maybe one, depending on how much you want to push the young freshmen or the young players in that room.
Sure.
So I think there's, whether you get an Arizona linebacker or just any linebacker out of the portal, and again, that's why I said yesterday on the show, one thing to consider is Arizona also has been recruiting players at other schools that maybe when that April-May period comes around, those guys will enter the portal. And now you have those relationships that we're not even thinking about at this current time. And you have enough bodies at linebacker to where I think they probably want to see what they can get out of the freshmen and the younger players. Like, how far ahead can our coaches get those guys by the end of spring, and then we'll reassess that position. But I do agree they need some help at linebacker, but I don't think, and again, because this is me thinking how Jedd Fisch talked in his press conference about wanting to build and develop. You're not going to bring in 3 transfer linebackers. You're probably going to bring in maybe 1 or 2, more like a Raylan Goforth. Okay, we just need a veteran there. We just kind of want to solidify it just a little bit. We don't want to, right? Which again, it's fine. You can have a few stopgap players, but you don't want to be doing that year in and year out. I think was the main point Jedd Fisch wanted to make.
No, you're absolutely right there. So we're gonna kind of stay away from the Noah Fafita to Tyrone McMillan discussion today, at least, because we saw them at the basketball game last night, and we'll kind of, again, that's when we're going to see how it plays out. There has been no definitive we are staying or we are going. That has not happened as of us recording this podcast. So that's something where, as you just said, the spring period could still decide things if they decide to wait it out. But there are a lot of questions that are still going to be answered there. But there are a couple questions that need to be answered on the coaching staff still, where there are a couple of guys who haven't, or not just a couple of guys, there are a couple of positions that haven't been filled yet. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the positions that have been filled, and then maybe, a couple of upgrades that can still be made. Right after we send a message to our good friends over at FanDuel, the NFL regular season is wrapping up, but there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bet ways to bet, like live same game parlays. You can find bets in the new Explore tab, make a parlay in the Parlay Hub, the best way to find popular parlays, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup. FanDuel is an official partner of the NFL. And speaking of the NFL, the Lions, man, I'm still riding with the Lions. I like that matchup they got against the Bucs this weekend. Is there any one matchup where you're looking at it and you're saying I like one team over another?
I mean, I'm just going to jump on your Lions bandwagon because that's been such a cool story to see. It's been such a cool story.
Love it. Appreciate it. The Lions bandwagon is a fun one, man. It's a great place to be. So let's all aboard. So let's talk about the coaching staff. Washington, as we're recording this, has announced 7 of the 10 assistant coaches. So there are a couple of questions about what those 3 remaining spots are going to look like, because spots that have not been filled are defensive coordinator, edge coach, a safeties coach, if you want it. So there are a couple different ways that this could be divvied up, right? When we look back at the Chris Peterson staff, and even Jimmy Lake's staff, he had 2 position coaches for cornerbacks for a while. Once that happened, when it was Will Harris, where it was Terrence Brown. So there was that angle that could have been taken. And then when we look back at Kalen DeBoer's staff, there was an edge coach and a defensive line coach, along with a cornerbacks coach and a safeties coach. So one thing I'm really curious about, and I know we're probably going to try to stay away from some of the Pete Carroll talk today, and we can kind of just look at some of the other places that this might be able to go, is how are you going to fill those 3 spots? Because when we look on the offensive side of the ball, I know you and I are both really excited about what Brendan Carroll might be able to do as offensive coordinator and the offensive line coach. We saw him do a really good job with everything down in Arizona. But the biggest question for me there is, could we just see a dedicated defensive coordinator like we talked about a little bit when it came to Pete Carroll? Or are we going to, is that the way that Jedd Fisch wants to go? Or is it going to be maybe, edge coach / defensive coordinator or something like that, where there are a lot of different ways to take this. And I feel like whatever way you go, there are going to be some benefits to that.
Yeah, well, I think the interesting thing that kind of when you look at the defensive coaches that he has out of it, it's Jason Kafusi, right? Is that how you're pronouncing the defensive line coach, right?
So, yeah.
So the interesting thing that I'm intrigued about him is he was the outside linebackers coach in Arizona last year, right? Which meant they also had I believe Hanson was linebackers coach, and there was some other title that he had. But the reason why I make that distinction is because that means they had 2 linebackers coaches and 1 D line coach. So to me, that to me kind of thinks if you're moving so I'm trying to get the name right, Kafusi, the defensive line, you're just going to have 1 defensive line coach. And then this is where you can add, do you get a second defensive backs coach or do you get a second front 7 coach? Because it's either going to be a linebacker coach or a safeties coach. Because I think, and with John Richardson being a cornerbacks coach, that almost kind of tells you, hey, somebody else has to man the safeties. Otherwise, you're going to need. That's kind of I know titles don't mean a ton, but when you just say cornerbacks coach, it's different than defensive backs coach. Whereas defensive line coach, you could make the argument it's the entire defensive line. So that's why, for me, I think you're probably going to go with a defensive coordinator / position coach, or but to your point, you could go linebacker coach, safeties coach, and defensive coordinator, and then just call that a day. Now, I don't know if has he named a special teams coach, because I think that
it's Jordan Powell.
Okay, that's what I thought. So and that's the one multi-position coach. So I think the last three are all going to be 1-1-1.
So, and that's really interesting because we haven't necessarily, because even when Pete Kwiatkowski was here, he was also coaching the outside linebackers, where we know that he got a lot of help there because he was just such a fantastic play caller. But that's one thing where I'm really curious to see if we just see a true dedicated defensive coordinator, because that's something that could be really beneficial in this day and age, where we've seen a lot of co-defensive coordinators, like we know under the last staff, it was William Inge helped out with the front 7, while Chuck Morrell would man the secondary and handle play calling. So there are a lot of different ways to divvy this up, and I don't necessarily think that one would be better than another. There are benefits to having each kind of style, and it's just a question of what's it going to look like, how is it going to play out. And I really like that he was able to bring the majority of his Arizona coaching staff with him, because not only is that a really, really solid group, but having that chemistry and that cohesion, which is why we saw Kalen DeBoer bring so many people with him from Fresno, that's really helpful where, it's just beneficial to have all these guys that have worked with one another before. And then, you can add in a guy like a Jamarcus Shepard. And that's another thing that we kind of wanted to get into was, where are you going to go with this hire? Because with these last 3 coaching spots, it still seems like they might have a decent amount of money available to go out and make a big time hire if they really, really wanted to. Because one of the things that Jedd Fisch told us was, I have the money to hire anybody I want in my assistant coach pool. And that seemed like a really big selling point as part of this contract from Troy Dana to make sure that he was able to come up here. And we've seen him, it's his entire staff from Arizona on the offensive side, but it's a really, really great staff.
Right, exactly. I mean, there was a reason why if Jamarcus Shepard ended up going to Alabama, fans were okay with that as long as Kevin Cummings came right with Jedd Fisch. And it took a couple of days, little bit of negotiation there, but eventually he did get announced. So I think that once he made that hire, that's also a kind of validation of the Jedd Fisch hire is, hey, the guys that he just worked with and just kind of cold shouldered at Arizona want to follow him to Washington. Because to be fair, and we've seen this with Kalen DeBoer a little bit, some coaches can choose to stay, right? Where you saw Ryan Grubb took a little bit of time to make that decision. Jamarcus Shepard clearly didn't want to leave. There was some others that William Minge, the defensive coordinator, linebacker coach, still on campus a couple of days ago. So I think it's pretty telling that a coach got a majority of his staff to come up. Now, Johnny Hanson already left for Texas. Dwayne Aquina already left for Texas. So it's kind of hard to get other guys to come, bounce around because it almost starts looking bad when you're bouncing, three different. I don't know if you remember this, but Matt Lubick took 3 jobs in 3 weeks during one off season. Yeah. So those are the hires you want to stay away from. And so it's, I think to me, a good sign that Jedd Fisch is also being methodical about who his defensive coordinator is. Because he easily, if he wanted to go not lowball, but if he wanted to just get a staff in place and get a hire, he would have had one by now. So I think to me, it's like, okay, he's knowing, to your point, how much money he's got to spend. That's not an object. So go get the best name that you can possibly find and take a little bit of time. You got to, I would say by the end of the week, he should have his staff in place, which is fine. He's got a couple more days to do it. So in that same vein, make the right hire and nobody will care how long it takes, because that right hire, whether it's PC or not, and I'm just saying PC so we don't talk about the name, but because it's probably not, right? But just whether it is or it isn't, that will be, because if you wait long enough and you get a massive home run hire, that's okay waiting for it versus, oh, hey, we settled for the linebacker coach at Montana State. No disrespect to whoever that might be, but I'm not just making an easy defensive coordinator hire, so to speak.
So, and that was a curious thing. Because remember, I got asked this question on Twitter a couple of days ago. It's all right. Well, who's the defensive coordinator going to be? We haven't heard any leaks, and that holds true. We haven't heard much of anything, which is really curious. And it's sometimes it's nice to be a little tight-lipped about what's going on, and so you can go through the process the way that you want to. But I think it's really interesting to know that there's still nothing that has come out about who that next hire might be. And we're all going to find out at the same point at just from what you and I both know.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's why it's honestly kind of good since we talked about it enough, but I mean, there's been a couple of hints at where, hey, these 2 guys are talking, he's somehow involved, but I have to imagine there's other, because again, we're still talking about 2 other positions, right? So you could still get a safeties coach who happens to be a co-defensive coordinator that we're not even thinking about, the Jedd Fisch. And here's another thing to consider about who that coordinator could be. All the NFL ties that Fisch has, maybe it's not the one we're thinking about, but he says, hey, you know what? Go get that guy. He's young. He's good. I like him. I can co-sign. And maybe it's a linebackers coach in the NFL that gets a Cody coordinator or gets a defensive coordinator title added to his title at Washington. So there's a number of ways that Jedd Fisch can go with this. And I think, again, I know I'm repeating myself, but the fact that he's going through this methodically, along with getting everyone he wants, I don't think he's missed on guys yet. I think that's fair to say.
I agree. It's you don't really want to compare one staff to another, but there are a lot of really promising things about the guys that have signed on so far, where you could say, okay, yeah, I see why, especially when you look at a guy like John Richardson. It's like, yeah, this guy seems like if we're looking at one staff versus another, that one might be where you say this is where the biggest upgrade has happened so far, where we saw some struggles in the secondary, and Jabbar Muhammad did a lot to help out and kind of mask some of those. And then we know that Juice Brown was the one guy who didn't get a contract extension after the 2022 season. So that it's just a little bit telling of what we saw from there to now. And now getting John Richardson, who did a really good job down there in Arizona. But Lars, we're going to switch gears here because we're going to stay away from the Noah Fifita conversation, but we're going to look at the most important position in football, and that's quarterback, and what that room might look like in 2024. Right after we send a message to our good friends over at Game Time, because you shouldn't have to worry about when you're buying tickets to your next big event. With killer last minute deals, all-in prices, views from receipt, and their best price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out. Because it's so easy to buy tickets on Game Time. You can find last-minute tickets, flash deals, zone deals. You can see views from every single seat in the venue, so you need to know exactly what to expect before you buy. All-in prices show your total upfront, so you know you're getting a great deal before you check out. Buy tickets in seconds with just 2 taps. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. So as we kind of talked about with the first segment, we're going to stay away from the Noah Fifita conversation. But we saw, as we opened the show with, we saw Damon Williams enter the transfer portal. 4-star recruit from the class of 2024, whose film is electric, man. He's really, really good. And we also know that Will Rogers and Austin Mack are in the transfer portal. We even saw walk-on Alex Johnson into the transfer portal. So right now, the only quarterback on Washington's roster is 3-star, or excuse me, he did get a bump. He got his 4th star. True freshman DeMarcius Davis, who you and I like. You and I think he's really promising, but he's a true freshman quarterback. So what do you think this could look like? Do you think that there's a possibility that Will Rogers, Austin Mack, or maybe even both decide, okay, yeah, this is going to be our best option, and we can stick around at Washington and just kind of see what happens? Or do you think that there's going to be a different route taken where it might be, we see a true freshman competition between somebody like Damon Williams who wants to follow Jedd Fisch and ends up in Washington, but with Davis, or is there going to be a mystery option that we don't know about yet?
Well, I think it's worth noting that Arizona, and again, it's a little bit different scenario of how it came together, but if you look at how Jedd Fisch had his quarterback room in Arizona, it was Jayden DeLora, a veteran, and
Right.
Noah Fifita, a rising up-and-coming redshirt freshman or redshirt sophomore. I don't remember which one of
Red-
those is. Freshman, right. So the fact that clearly he's not afraid to have multiple quarterbacks that he can use right away. So part of me thinks both Rogers and Matt could make that work, right, with you still have Davis
Sure.
maybe coming in and competing, and then you just bring in one quarterback, right, which would be Williams, right? So that's how in an ideal world, how it works. And the one thing to consider with both Austin Mack and Will Rogers, both can transfer again. Rogers can only transfer one more time. Now, again, he's only got one more year of eligibility, so his next move has got to be the move. Or now with Austin Mack, he can come back, compete in the spring, maybe have 1 year here, and then if he doesn't play this year under Fisch or doesn't get as much reps or snaps as he wants, then he can transfer. He's got 2 places to transfer, 2 options, or 2 times that he can transfer. So I think it's more of a realistic chance that Matt comes back and at least gives it a shot under a pretty well-known quarterback developer in Jedd Fisch. Will Rogers is kind of the enigma in that situation where I could see him working in the offense, but I do think he might also want a little bit more of what he's been used to, kind of in that Ryan Grubb style of offense where, hey, look, I'm just looking for that passing offense, looking for just 1 more year. But the question is, if Alabama and Ryan Grubb don't bring him down to Alabama, if you're Will Rogers, where are you going to go at this point in time? You basically would have to wait until spring ball finishes and then transfer again. Let's say he comes back to Washington, withdraws his name in the portal. They go through spring ball, and then Rogers at the end of April or May says, okay, I want to transfer now.
Sure.
I gave it a shot, didn't work out, whatever. But how are you going to find a home that quickly? I mean, we saw Cam Ward pivot to Miami, but he had been committed to Miami a couple of times. That was always kind of a expected destination for him. At this point, most schools have already either got their quarterback or are rolling with the younger players that they're going to have on their roster. So it's kind of unfair to Rodgers, but I could almost just see him. I think as long as he gets comfortable with Fisch, he might as well stay. Just give it a shot. And that doesn't prevent a potential transfer of Fifita, who could, because again, Rodgers only played 6 games last year. Fifita came in after Jane DeLora had some things happen. So it's not like Fifita's, he was expected to be the starter at Arizona, and he obviously would be this fall if he stays down there. But he's also kind of had to work his way up. So he's not a bona fide quintessential, he's not Michael Penix. He's not Quinn Ewers, right? He's up there. He's getting to that point.
So here's my thing on that aspect of it all, because I have a couple thoughts here. The first thing is, if Will Rogers comes back, I would expect Noah Fifita to stay at Arizona.
Yep.
Where I don't necessarily know that those two can coexist. Not that they don't like each other or anything, but when we look at that, it's okay. Noah Fifita is the incumbent starter at Arizona. Why would you leave that to go battle for a job? Where if we see Will Rogers commit somewhere else, I feel like that might be a positive sign for how the staff feels like it might be able to get Noah Fifita. But outside of that, the one thing that I'm really curious about is, I don't want to call this a worst case scenario, but it's just kind of a very different outlook on things. If it's, let's say Damon Williams does follow Jedd Fisch to Washington, and it's Damon Williams versus DeMarcius Davis for the starting role. Let's say that's the world that we're living in. I don't necessarily know if I'd have a problem with that, where there's still a lot of upgrades that need to be made across the roster, especially when we look at what the offensive line scenario is right now, where basically everybody's in the transfer portal. Again, they could still pull their names out. We could see that looking very different by the time spring ball rolls around than we do right now. So that's something that we need to consider in all this. But I don't know if I'd have a problem with that, because they're both very intriguing prospects in my mind. They very different, like size-wise. I know both of them need to put on a little bit of weight to play at the college level, but they're both really mobile. They both have a ton of arm talent. And it's this whole thing of, all right, if we're going to take our lumps this year anyways, because I know you and I both said that you can find 8 wins on the schedule very easily. Yeah, some of that does depend on what the roster looks like. But when we look at that battle, it's easy enough to say, especially with you just talking about how Jedd Fisch is able to develop quarterbacks. If you look at what that battle might look like, that's a really exciting prospect going forward, especially when we look at some of the wide receivers that are still around on the roster. When right now it's Giles Jackson, it's Jeremiah Hunter, it's Denzel Boston. I know you and I both like that trio a lot. Of course, there's still upgrades that can be made. Talk about Jeremy Bernard. You talk about that potential. I know we said we we're going to stay away from it, but the potential of Tyrell McMillan, whatever that might look like, there's still upgrades that can be made there. You and I like Justice Williams and Jason Robinson, the true freshman, a lot. Rasheed Williams, Keith Reynolds. I know that basically rounds out where the roster is right now. But there's a lot of exciting things to think about from that standpoint. So having one of those true freshmen develop some chemistry with those guys, and outside of Hunter and Jackson, there's a bunch of young talented receivers in the room, maybe getting 2 years of experience with those guys going forward. It's not necessarily the worst thing in the world. It's certainly not a best case scenario, but it's something that as of right now, when we look at this roster on Thursday, January 18th, it's something we might need to consider.
Right, and I think the other thing, kind of in tandem just with the offense in general, if you are rolling with a redshirt freshman or freshman quarterback, that having a solid running back stable and a solid offensive line kind of balances out a true freshman at quarterback, right?
Yep,
where
I agree.
If you have Jonah Coleman, Cam Davis, and insert third back that actually has done something of considerable amount, probably from the portal, then that doesn't look as bad as, okay, you have Cam Davis and, Williams, or Cam Davis and DeMarcius Davis, right? Davis and Davis, right?
Sure.
If you had both those guys, then it's like, wow, one's coming off a season-long injury and one's a true freshman. Now we're looking at 4 wins more so than 6 wins. But
outside of that, it's not even just that. It's a situation a lot like what we saw with Dylan Johnson at running back this past year, where when Dylan Johnson got hurt and he wasn't able to perform at 100%, the running game was somewhat non-existent for a while, where we know that there's a lot of upside in that room, but it just didn't seem like Ryan Grubb was really ready to rely on any of those guys in an extended role. And having to your point, just having two running backs changes that a lot.
Right. And then obviously kind of that third running back is the one where, okay, if so-and-so goes down, like if Cam Davis goes down, now you have two versus again, to your point, if you have Dylan Johnson and Cam Davis plus friends, those friends are nice. And again, we like Will Nixon, what he could provide, and we like Tybo Rogers and what he could provide. But those guys never really had that breakthrough, true performance that we kind of were expecting, especially Nixon.
I feel like that's a good place to just kind of wrap this one up because there's going to be so much more news coming out over the next couple of weeks. So for all of that news, make sure you stay right here on Locked On Huskies, where we'll keep you up to date with everything that's going on in the world. Lars, as always, thank you so much for being here. To all the everydayers out there, thank you so much for tuning in. We just passed 2,000 subscribers on YouTube. That's really awesome. It's a massive landmark for us. We really appreciate that because you all are the ones who make that possible, and we're really, really grateful for that. Thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. So that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating this channel every single day with new content, so make sure you keep it right here on Locked On Huskies. Leave a like on the video. Leave us a comment down below. If you're audio only, make sure you leave us a 5-star review. That all helps our channel out so much. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will talk to you on Monday.